When she finally realizes that you are no longer there, no messages, no reactions, no emotional availability, it does not feel like ordinary loss to her. It feels like something far more destabilizing. A narcissistic woman does not experience love the way an empath does. What she experiences is narcissistic supply, attention, validation, emotional energy. You were not just a partner. You were a mirror that confirmed her sense of importance. And when that mirror disappears, the image she relied on begins to distort. At first, she assumes it is temporary. Silence, to her, has always been a tactic, something that eventually breaks the other person. But this time the silence does not bend, and that is where the shock begins. Control was never something she questioned before, it was simply assumed. Jung would describe this moment as the collapse of a dominant complex, the psychological structure that organized her sense of self. Without your presence to reinforce it, the structure weakens. What follows is not sadness in the traditional sense, it is disorientation. Her confidence no longer lands the way it used to. Her charm no longer guarantees a response. The external world stops confirming the internal fantasy. This is deeply unsettling because narcissism depends on continuity, the belief that admiration will always be available. When that continuity breaks, anxiety rushes in. She begins to feel an unfamiliar tension, a quiet panic beneath the surface. Something essential is missing, but she cannot name it as love. To do so would require vulnerability, and vulnerability threatens the ego she has spent years protecting. So instead, the loss registers as emptiness, irritation, and restlessness. And here is the truth worth holding on to. When your absence causes this level of inner disturbance, it means your presence once carried real psychological weight. The moment you stop feeding the illusion is the moment the illusion begins to starve. After the initial shock settles, something more subtle and more painful begins to take hold. This is where ego injury appears. A narcissistic woman can tolerate many things, but what she cannot tolerate is the realization that she is no longer central in someone's inner world. Your emotional withdrawal doesn't simply disappoint her, it wounds the image she holds of herself. And this wound does not bleed outward. It bleeds inward, quietly. From the outside she may look unchanged, calm, confident, but internally a kind of silent panic develops. Jung spoke often about the ego's dependence on external validation when the inner self has not been properly integrated. When admiration disappears, the ego has nothing to lean on. That is when the mind starts looping, replaying conversations, reinterpreting moments, searching for the point where dominance slipped away. This panic is not about love lost, it is about identity threatened. Narcissistic confidence is not rooted in self-knowledge, but in reflection. When you no longer reflect back admiration, the structure of her self-concept begins to wobble. She may feel restless, irritated, or unusually preoccupied with how others see her. The smallest indifference from the world now feels amplified, because it echoes the original wound, your absence. What makes this phase so dangerous is that it often drives impulsive behavior. She may seek attention elsewhere, exaggerate her success, or subtly rewrite the narrative of the relationship to protect her ego. None of this brings relief. It only postpones the confrontation she is trying to avoid. And this is the insight that matters for you. The moment someone's silence destabilizes another person's sense of self, it proves that silence is no longer weakness. It is power reclaimed. When you stop explaining, chasing, or proving your worth, you force reality to speak instead. And reality, unlike words, cannot be argued with. As time passes and the external world no longer responds the way it once did, something inevitable begins to happen. The performance can no longer be sustained. A narcissistic woman is highly skilled at managing impressions, but every performance requires an audience. When there is no one left to impress, the mask begins to slip, not dramatically, but quietly. In moments of solitude she cannot escape. Jung would describe this as an encounter with the shadow, the parts of the psyche that have been denied, repressed, or projected onto others. For someone who has lived through charm and control, the shadow is not just uncomfortable, it is threatening. Without your presence to absorb emotional tension, she is left alone with feelings she never learned to regulate: emptiness, envy, boredom, and an undefined sense of inner absence. This is often when irritability increases, small things feel heavier, distractions stop working, the constant need to stay stimulated becomes exhausting. What once felt like confidence now feels like restlessness. And in private moments, when no validation is available, a question emerges that she has spent her life avoiding: who am I without reflection? The mask was never only for others. It was also how she avoided herself. By staying admired, desired, and pursued, she never had to look inward. But now, in the absence of that external focus, she is confronted with the emotional cost of avoidance. This is not insight yet, it is discomfort. Growth requires awareness, and awareness requires tolerance for inner tension, something narcissism is designed to escape. Most will try to reapply the mask elsewhere, finding a new audience rather than facing the shadow. But the experience leaves a trace. Something has been felt that cannot be completely unfelt. And here is what matters for you. When someone begins to unravel in your absence, it is not cruelty, it is consequence. The moment you step out of the role they assigned you, you give both of you the same opportunity to face the truth or to keep running from it. At this stage, something that looks like regret may begin to surface. But it is important to understand what kind of regret this is. A narcissistic woman may acknowledge loss, but acknowledgement is not the same as accountability. What she feels is not a clear awareness of the harm she caused, it is the discomfort of losing what once stabilized her inner world. She misses the role you played, not the wounds you carried. From a Jungian perspective, this is where the ego attempts to preserve itself, by reframing reality. Rather than confronting her own behavior, she reshapes the story. She may tell herself she did her best, that you were too sensitive, or that circumstances, not choices, caused the rupture. This psychological maneuver protects her self-image while allowing her to feel a diluted form of regret that doesn't demand real change. True remorse requires something far more difficult: the willingness to let the ego be humbled. It means admitting, without defense, I harmed someone because I could not face myself. For most narcissistic personalities, this feels like annihilation. So instead of remorse, you see selective memory, partial apologies, or emotional language that sounds sincere but lacks responsibility. The words may be there, but the depth is missing. This is often confusing for those who genuinely loved her. You may wonder why the regret feels hollow, why it doesn't lead to transformation. The answer is simple but painful. Insight without accountability is not insight. It is self-protection in disguise. Jung warned that when the ego refuses to integrate its shadow, it will repeat its patterns unconsciously, no matter how much it claims to understand them. And here is the clarity you need to carry forward. You are not waiting for someone else's remorse to validate your experience. Healing begins the moment you stop negotiating with half acknowledgments and start honoring the truth you already know. Regret that changes nothing is not a bridge back. It is a signpost telling you to keep moving forward. When regret fails to restore what was lost, the psyche often shifts into a more active mode. This is where attempts to reclaim control begin. A narcissistic woman does not easily accept a reality in which she is no longer influential. If she cannot soothe the ego internally, she will try to reorganize the external world to do it for her. And that often means reaching back toward the very person she once took for granted. The return may not look dramatic. It can be subtle. Unexpected warmth, nostalgia, a sudden understanding she never expressed before. Sometimes it appears as vulnerability, sometimes as guilt, sometimes as praise. But beneath the surface, the motivation is raw. Eli reconciliation in the deeper sense. It is restoration of influence, relevance, and emotional leverage. Jung would say the ego, feeling threatened, mobilizes its old strategies rather than surrendering to transformation. This phase is especially dangerous for those who are empathic or introspective. You may interpret these gestures as growth, as evidence that your absence caused insight. But insight without sustained self-reflection does not last. What feels like change is often a temporary adjustment designed to pull you back into a familiar role. Once stability returns, the old dynamics quietly follow. What is happening psychologically is simple. Control feels safer than uncertainty. True change would require her to tolerate shame, ambiguity, and inner emptiness long enough for something new to form. Most people retreat from that edge. Reclaiming control is easier than rebuilding the self. This is where your role becomes critical, not through confrontation, explanation, or persuasion, but through consistency. When you do not respond to emotional hooks the way you once did, the strategy loses power, and power that no longer works eventually gets abandoned. Truth to hold on to. Genuine transformation never needs to convince you. It stands on its own, without urgency, manipulation, or pressure. When you refuse to be pulled back into old patterns, you don't just protect your peace, you declare that your value is no longer negotiable. At the end of this process, the most meaningful change does not occur where many people expect it to. It does not unfold dramatically within her. It unfolds quietly within you. When you begin to heal, detach, and reclaim parts of yourself that were once organized around her needs, the entire psychological equation shifts. Your growth becomes the one variable she can no longer influence. From a Jungian perspective, this is individuation, the movement toward wholeness through self-awareness rather than approval. As you rebuild your inner life, your boundaries become clearer, your reactions more deliberate, and your sense of self less dependent on being chosen. This is deeply unsettling for someone who once derived stability from your emotional availability. Not because you are punishing her, but because you are no longer participating in the old dynamic. Often this is when the loss becomes fully real for her. Not when you leave, not when you stop explaining, but when she sees that you are no longer defined by the wound. Your calm, your silence, your forward movement become a mirror she cannot control. And in that mirror she sees not just what she lost, but what she can no longer access. This is the paradox many people miss. Your healing is not an act against her. It is an act toward yourself. But psychologically, it carries more weight than confrontation ever could. Jung observed that what we do not integrate continues to confront us from the outside. When you integrate your experience and grow beyond it, you stop playing the role she needs you to play. You may never receive closure in words. You may never hear genuine remorse, but closure arrives the moment your life no longer revolves around unanswered questions. When your self-respect becomes stronger than your need to be understood, the lesson is complete. Now, this is the final reflection to carry with you, the most powerful. Response to being undervalued is not revenge, explanation, or silence. It is becoming whole.